The notification sound on my phone was the last thing I heard before she said it. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room, my left hand wrapped in gauze from the fire, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains to stay calm. The doctor had just told me the burns weren't severe. 2nd degree on 3 fingers. I'd be fine. The studio, though 4 years of my life reduced to smoke and warped steel beams somewhere in the warehouse district of Austin, that was a different conversation entirely. She walked in 40 minutes after I called her. I remember being relieved just to see her face. Melissa had this way of filling a room, that kind of woman who commands attention without trying. She was still in her work clothes, blazer over a silk blouse, heels clicking on the hospital floor. I reached out my unbandaged hand toward her and she looked at it, the way you look at a puddle you almost stepped in. I talked to your business partner, she said. He told me everything. I dropped my hand. Derek called you? He said the firm is done. No insurance payout. The fire inspector is already calling it negligence. She crossed her arms. He said you let the permits lapse. That you were cutting corners for months. I looked at her for a long moment. That's not true. Ryan. She said my name like a closing argument. I've been patient. I moved to Austin for you. I turned down the Chicago offer for you. And now this. She glanced at my bandaged hand, then away. I can't build a life on someone who can't even keep a business license current. There it was. The thing she'd been rehearsing in the car on the way over. I could tell by how clean the sentences were. So that's it, I said. I've already called my sister. I'm staying with her tonight. She set her key to our apartment on the chair beside me without looking at me. I think you should find somewhere else to go when you're discharged. I need the next 30 days on the lease. She turned and her heels clicked back across the tiles and she walked out the sliding glass doors into the parking lot. The automatic doors closed behind her like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. The nurse at the desk gave me a careful look. Sir, can I get you anything? I stared at the chair where Melissa had set my key. No, I said. I'm good. I wasn't good. But I was thinking very clearly. Here is the thing about Derek Osman. We'd built Calloway Osman Design Group together from a shared workspace and a combined credit card debt. He was the face, the pitch meetings, the handshakes. I was the work. The actual work. Every project that earned us a reputation, every structural detail that made editors at architecture magazines call us quietly brilliant, that was mine. Derek knew how to talk about it better than I did. What Derek didn't know, what he had conveniently forgotten in his rush to call my girlfriend and poison the well, was the structure I had quietly built underneath everything we shared. 5 years ago, before we ever signed the partnership agreement, my grandfather passed and left me the controlling interest in Calloway Heritage Group, a holding company incorporated in Delaware that my family had used for real estate and licensing since 1987. It wasn't glamorous. It was mostly dormant when I inherited it. But I was 27 and had just taken one business law class, and I did one smart thing by accident. I filed the core design patents, the structural methodology we'd been developing under Calloway Heritage Group, not under the partnership. Derek signed a licensing agreement with the holding company to use those methods. He signed it the way people sign things they don't read when they're excited and in a hurry. It was 3 pages. The font was 11 point. The key clause was on page 2. I never mentioned it again. It didn't seem necessary. Until now. The apartment I found was a furnished month-to-month place near South Congress. Nothing special. I took my laptop and the external drives I kept at home, habit, because I'd always been paranoid about losing work, and I sat in that empty apartment for 3 days, eating takeout and reading every document I still had access to. What I found was worse than I expected and better than I needed. Derek had already started moving. He'd contacted 3 of our biggest clients directly, positioning himself as the surviving principal of the firm. He'd filed paperwork to reorganize under a new entity, Osman Studio, and had the audacity to register the domain the morning after the fire. The man had been waiting for this. Maybe not the fire specifically, but a moment like it. He also, and this was the part that settled cold in my chest, had been sleeping with Melissa for 6 months. I found out by accident. I was going through my cloud backup looking for a client contract when I found a folder I hadn't noticed before, photos she'd sent from her phone to my shared drive by mistake. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and took a walk around the block. Then another. I came back and opened it again and looked at the date stamps. 6 months. During the period, she was telling me she was working late. When she came home distracted and I thought she was stressed about her job. When she stopped touching me with any warmth and I blamed the long hours I was putting into the studio. The fire was being called negligence. The permits had lapsed because Derek was supposed to renew them. He handled all the administrative filings. I handled the design work and the client relationships. That was our agreement from the beginning, division of operational responsibilities, clearly documented in our partnership charter. I pulled the charter. His name was next to regulatory compliance and municipal licensing. Right there. 11 words and a signature. I sent a copy to my lawyer that night. Her name is Patricia Wren, and she is the most methodical person I have ever met. I called her at 8 in the morning 2 days later, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting. "You still have the patents?" she said when I finished. "Yes." "And the licensing agreement?" "Yes." "And the partnership charter clearly places permit responsibility on him?" "Yes." A pause. "Ryan, he's trying to rebuild using your intellectual property without a valid license. The moment the original partnership dissolved, the licensing agreement terms triggered a renegotiation clause." "I know. He doesn't know that." "I know," I said again. "How do you want to handle this?" I looked out the window of my borrowed apartment at the street below. "Quietly," I said. "And completely. I didn't contact Derek. I didn't contact Melissa. I changed my personal phone number and gave the new one to maybe 8 people. I updated my professional profiles to say I was on sabbatical pursuing independent projects. I let the silence do its work." Patricia filed the first notice 10 days after our call. A formal demand to Osmond Studio registered 10 days old at that point, Derek's new venture requiring immediate cessation of any projects utilizing the Calloway structural methodology. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It referenced the patent numbers, the licensing agreement, and the dissolution trigger clause. It was calm and final, and it landed on Derek's desk on a Tuesday. I heard through a mutual contact in the industry that he read it and then sat very still for a long time. Meanwhile, Melissa had moved into Derek's loft in East Austin. She announced it on Instagram with a photo of a coffee mug on a windowsill with the caption "New Chapter, New Light." I looked at it once. The windowsill had a very specific tile pattern I recognized immediately. I'd specified that tile for the loft renovation 3 years ago. I was the one who'd sourced it from a supplier in Portugal. It took 6 weeks to arrive and Derek had complained about the wait. Now, Melissa was setting her morning coffee on it like she'd always lived there. I closed the app and didn't open it again. The first domino fell quietly. Derek had already signed a contract with a commercial developer out of Houston, a mid-size mixed-use project. The kind of work we used to dream about when we were sharing that cramped workspace. The contract was for Osmond Studio, but the design methodology underpinning the bid was ours, filed under the patents Calloway Heritage Group held. Patricia sent a cease and desist directly to the Houston developer's legal team. That conversation, I'm told, was brief. The developer pulled out of the contract within 72 hours. Derek lost a $2.3 million project on a Thursday afternoon. Melissa apparently called him in a panic that evening. I know because a mutual friend told me, not because I was watching. She'd started asking questions about his finances. The loft, it turned out, was not owned outright. It was mortgaged against the value of Osmond Studio as a going concern. If the firm had no operating revenue, the loft had a problem. She didn't know that yet, but she was starting to ask. Derek called me that weekend. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that started aggressive and ended somewhere close to scared. Something about working this out like professionals. Something about how we built this together. I saved the voicemail. Patricia added it to the file. The second notice went to the 3 clients he'd poached directly after the fire. All 3 had started work with Osmond Studio under the assumption that the methodology and design standards were part of the package. Patricia's letter explained, politely and in specific legal language, that they were not. 2 of the 3 responded within a week. 1 hired their own counsel and pushed back. That one took a little longer, but the outcome was the same. By week 6, Osmond Studio had no active projects. Derek had burned through his operating reserve fighting the legal notices. His name was starting to circulate in the industry with the specific kind of quiet concern that travels faster than any press release. Melissa posted less frequently. Then barely at all. The coffee mug on the windowsill disappeared from her feed. She posted a photo from a restaurant with a caption that said nothing of substance, just a blurry image and the word fine. It looked like someone learning that fine and okay are not the same thing. She tried calling my old number twice. Got a disconnected message. Then she found my new contact through my assistant, left a message that started with "I heard things are complicated for Derek right now," and asked if we could talk. The message was about her. All of it. She framed every sentence around what she needed to understand, what she deserved to know, what wasn't fair to her. She did not mention that she'd left me in a hospital waiting room with a burned hand and a key on a plastic chair. I did not call back. I had moved by then. I'd been working remotely on a project I'd been approached about before the fire, a boutique hotel renovation in Denver, a client I'd built a relationship with independently, Someone who knew my work and wanted specifically the things that were mine alone. I'd been putting it off because the studio kept me busy. Now I had time. I flew to Denver on a Tuesday with one carry-on bag and a clean notebook. The design director at the hotel, a woman named Claire who had been in the industry for 20 years, met me in the lobby and shook my hand and said she was glad I'd finally said yes. I stood in that lobby and looked at the bones of the building, the height of the ceilings, the way light came through the east-facing windows, the original tile work under decades of carpet that you could just see at the edges, and for the first time in 2 months I felt something that wasn't grief or calculation. I felt like myself. Back in Austin, the situation continued to unfold without my involvement. Derek had tried to renegotiate the licensing terms directly with Calloway Heritage Group, which meant he was now aware of the full picture. He made an offer. Patricia forwarded it to me in Denver and I read it over breakfast. The offer was for a buyout of the patents at roughly 30% of their assessed value. I set my coffee down and thought about that number for a moment. I sent back a counteroffer that was the full assessed value plus a licensing penalty for unauthorized use during the 6-month period he'd been operating without a valid agreement. The counteroffer also included a requirement for a public acknowledgement of the patent ownership to be shared with the industry contacts he'd misled. He declined. Patricia filed suit the following Monday. The lawsuit was not secret. Lawsuits rarely are, especially in a field like architecture where professional reputation is currency. Within a week, the details were being discussed at industry events. Derek was attending to try to rebuild his network. I heard from Claire in Denver that someone had brought it up at a conference in Dallas. Derek, apparently, had tried to characterize it as a misunderstanding between former partners. People in that room knew my work. They nodded politely and went home and did not return his follow-up emails. Melissa found my new number through someone else entirely and called it from an unknown contact. I recognized her voice in the first second. Ryan. A pause. I know you're not going to make this easy. I said nothing. I need to understand what's happening. Derek is saying this is all some kind of vendetta, that you're doing this because of us. I looked out the window of the Denver hotel where I was staying. Snow on the mountains at that distance. Clean and very far away. I'm protecting intellectual property that belongs to me, I said. That's the whole story. He said you knew about us and this is revenge. He's allowed to say whatever he wants. Ryan, Melissa. I kept my voice even. You put a key on a chair and told me to find somewhere else to live while my hand was still bandaged. You made a choice. I'm not angry about it. But I'm also not available for this conversation. The silence on her end was long enough that I could hear she was somewhere with ambient noise, a cafe, maybe, or a lobby. Background sounds of people living ordinary lives. I didn't know things were this serious, she said finally. With the firm. With all of it. No, I said. You didn't. I ended the call. The lawsuit moved forward through the usual stages. Derek made 2 more settlement offers, both of which Patricia and I declined. By month 4, his legal bills were significant and Osmond Studios' accounts were effectively depleted. His personal finances were tied tightly enough to the firm that the complications were now his complications, not just the businesses. The loft, the one with the Portuguese tile Melissa had been photographing her coffee mugs on, went up for sale on a Friday. I saw the listing, not because I was looking, but because someone forwarded it to me with a brief note. The asking price was below market by enough to suggest urgency. Melissa moved out 2 weeks before it sold. I know because she posted one photo, a bare room with an afternoon light and no caption at all. It was the most honest thing she'd posted in months. I'd started something in Denver that was taking shape in ways I hadn't anticipated. The hotel project was going well enough that Claire had introduced me to 2 of the ownership group's partners, people who had a portfolio of properties across the Mountain West and had been looking for a design voice they could develop a long-term relationship with. We had 3 conversations. Then we had a more formal meeting. Then we had an agreement. I incorporated a new studio under Calloway Heritage Group. Not a rebranding. A proper new entity with clean structure, proper licensing from the holding company, and a clear record of ownership from day one. No ambiguity, no paper left unread. I hired 2 people I'd worked with before who'd also been burned by the chaos Derek had created when he tried to absorb their contracts into his new firm. Both of them said yes within 24 hours. The lawsuit settled on a Wednesday in late November. The terms were confidential, but the public acknowledgement clause was not. That was non-negotiable, and Derek's lawyers eventually accepted it. A short statement went out through industry channels clarifying the patent ownership and the licensing history. It was 3 sentences. It didn't editorialize. It didn't need to. Patricia called me after the papers were signed. You handled this exactly right, she said. I had a good lawyer. You had a clear head, she said. That matters more. The Denver hotel opened in the spring. Claire held a small event for press and industry people, and I stood in the lobby I'd spent 8 months rethinking and watched people walk through it. Watched them stop in the places I'd designed them to stop. Watched them look up at the ceiling where I'd restored the original plasterwork and added indirect light that made the whole room feel like late afternoon regardless of the hour. Watched them feel something without knowing why. I got a message that evening from a number I didn't have saved. I almost didn't open it. Then I did. It was Melissa. Short. Careful. It said, "I heard the hotel opened. I saw the photos. It's beautiful. I hope you're doing well." I stared at that message for a while. I thought about the waiting room, the key on the chair, the voicemail where she told me she couldn't build a life on someone who couldn't keep things together. I thought about Derek's smug early confidence and the way it had slowly dissolved into desperation and finally into a settlement table where he signed his name on terms he'd spent 4 months trying to avoid. I thought about a burned studio and a borrowed apartment and a clean notebook and a flight to Denver. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the conversation I'd been in the middle of, with Claire and 2 of the ownership partners and a young architect from Portland who was sharp in exactly the way I'd been at his age. Someone handed me a glass of something and asked how I was doing. I smiled. Not a cold smile. Not a performance. Just a real one. "Better than I expected," I said. Outside, through the east-facing windows I'd specifically left unobstructed, the last of the daylight was sitting on the mountains the way I'd known it would. I'd planned for that view. I'd argued for it in 3 separate design reviews when people wanted to fill those windows with something else. Some things are worth being quiet about until the moment arrives and suddenly everyone can see exactly what you were building all along. I didn't respond to Melissa's message. Not that night, not ever. Not because I was still angry, I genuinely wasn't. But because there was nothing useful in that direction. Only the old story, and I was already deep into a new one. The Portland architect was asking me about a project in Bozeman. Claire was nodding with that particular expression she had when she already knew the answer but wanted to see how you'd get there. I set my glass down and started talking.